That looks like it's on. Oh, so you're... Okay.
Adrian? Oh, we are live. Okay, so our last session today is on financial services. Our speakers are George Grigoropoulos. He is a co-organizer of the London Ayn Rand meetup. He has worked in finance for 15 years for some of the world's largest banks and financial services companies. And Andrew Boff is the chair of the London Assembly Planning Committee. So, George.
Thanks, Razi. Now, before I begin, I would like to point out that the ideas that I'm going to be expressing today are not representative of the organizations I've worked for, the organization I work for currently, and I'm just expressing my own opinions. So I would like to refrain from mentioning my employers during this talk. Now, I think, to start with, in order to assess the risk of a Labour government to the financial sector in terms of regulation, we should first assess how much regulation there currently is, what is the impact of it, whether it's bad or good, whether there is an alternative to that, and whether the parties that exist, the major parties, are any different to Labour should come last. So how much are UK financial services companies regulated? Well, let's start from a few numbers. So in 1980, there was one UK regulator for every 11,000 people employed in finance, compared to one for every 300 by 2011. The Financial Services Authority, which in 2013 was split into two, the Financial Conduct Authority and the Prudential Regulation Authority, had the same number of people that now the FCA alone has just 6 years later. So at this rate of growth, the number of regulators will overtake the number of people working in finance soon enough. Now, what does this mean? This means that today we have more resources than ever extracted from the productive economy and moved into the statutory regulatory sector, all of which obviously comes at a dear cost. So when we're talking about cost, how much does it really cost for companies to comply? It is estimated that for a mid-sized European bank to comply with just Basel III requirements takes about 200 full-time jobs. So given that Europe has around 350 banks with assets over 1 billion euros, this translates into over 70,000 new full-time jobs just to comply with Basel III requirements. Today, banks have to fulfill demands from national authorities, in this country the PRA and the FCA, as I explained, the European Banking Authority, the Single Supervisory Mechanism, the European Securities and Markets Authority, and the national central banks, in this country that's the Bank of England. Currently, 4% of total revenue goes to compliance costs. This is expected to get to 10% of total revenue by 2022. That means that for you as a shareholder or a customer, you're paying a huge price towards non-productive activities, and that by 2022 you'll be paying twice and a half as much as you're paying today. So why are so many people needed for compliance? What do they actually do? So all these people are tasked with deciphering the holy regulatory scriptures and making sure that banks comply with the commandments of the regulators. So to give you a kind of estimate of how much of that there is, in 2011, the UK financial regulator issued regulatory documentation totaling 4.3 million words. That's more than 5 times the length of the Bible. Now, if you imagine that we have all these priests interpreting the Bible, try to think how many compliance job words we need in order to interpret the regulations. The various EU laws that dictate how banks should operate are at various stages of completion, and so far they cover over 2,000 pages. That total is set to increase to 60,000 pages as primary legislation is translated into detailed rule writing. Regulatory reporting requirements, where banks are asked to produce reports and send them to the regulators on a regular basis, were introduced in this country in 1974. At the time, it could have been around 150 entries in a document that they had to send to the regulators. Today, UK banks are required to fill in more than 7,500 separate cells of data, which represents a 50-fold rise. Forthcoming European legislation will cause a further multiplication. Banks across Europe could, in the future, be required to fill 30 to 50,000 data cells spread across 60 different regulatory forms. So what if banks decide, okay, we're not going to employ all these people to do all this stuff, we're not going to do all of it, we're going to do half of it or not as much as we're being asked to do? Well, they may end up losing their license, or more likely they'll end up paying huge fines. In 2015, the Financial Conduct Authority issued nearly £1 billion of fines. And at this point, it's important to note that the Financial Conduct Authority has the ability to determine its own burden of proof, issue fines, and prevent people from working in any area of the financial markets. It has enforcement powers similar to courts without the checks and balances of courts. So we know it's big, but how bad is it? What is the impact of this regulation? This is a complex question to answer, but I'll try to do my best. Regulation brings uniformity, and extreme regulation brings extreme uniformity. And extreme uniformity means less innovation, because to innovate, you have to act in a different way, in some way or form. It is no surprise that a recent study held by a federal authority that has no commercial purpose can foresee emerging risks better than a distributed system of market players, and hence force all players to implement the same measures for mitigating this risk, is the biggest cause of what it tries to prevent: systemic risk. Because if the regulators get it wrong, then everyone in the marketplace within the jurisdiction also gets it wrong, which leads to a legitimization of bailouts. Because if I, as a banker, have done what you, the government, has asked me to do, and not what I wanted to do, and then I fail, then I quite rightly come to you and tell you, well, pay me to support me because I've done everything right by your standards. So then the government pays, but where is all that money coming from? Well, it's coming from taxes, it's coming from quantitative easing, it's coming from borrowing, and it's coming from currency manipulation, which in turn leads to what? It leads to investment management being reduced to just trying to second guess what the bureaucrats and the politicians are going to decide to do the following morning. And in my field, in risk management and internal audit, I have seen a huge transformation from trying to implement processes and decisions that make business sense to trying to implement what the regulator would like to see. Now, in some cases that may be right, in some cases it may make sense, but just the purpose of always trying to please the regulator without using our own critical judgment is equivalent to falling asleep at the wheel because we have cruise control that's government approved. So if the regulation is big and is bad, is there an alternative? In the first version of my talk, I had a long history lesson about 300 years of financial service, but I don't have to do that. I don't have time to do that. So you'll have to take a bit of my word for it. So the financial revolution was brought London to financial prominence towards the end of the 17th century. At that time, and for the 300 years around, since the time to the 1980s, Was there government regulation of the financial services sector? Yes, there was, but it was minimal, and it kept going up at an increasing degree. Did the financial sector thrive during that time? Yes, it did. That's why it was called the financial revolution. Were there any large-scale financial defaults, including defaults with potential risk of contagion? Yes, there were quite a few. The Overend Bank, the Bearing Bank, and other banks failed during the time. Were there any market crises? Yes, there were a few. But we must not forget the geopolitical context of those times. If government regulation was minimal to zero, was there any other regulation? Yes, there was market-enforced regulation by industry and professional bodies. In addition, there were obviously laws against those who were proven guilty of defrauding customers and investors. So what did the politicians do to address or prevent those crises? In most cases, nothing. They let the marketplace punish failed business ideas, reward businesses that had been prudent and successful, and they rewarded them by allowing them to have cheaper assets to buy from the failing banks. In conclusion, yes, there is an alternative. Financial markets were regulated effectively by the market itself for centuries, and even today, despite the best efforts of the government to regulate every single activity, private regulatory institutions still exist. The International Swaps and Derivatives Association provides a safe and efficient derivatives market kind of dispute resolution mechanism. So, now coming to political parties. Are the political parties, including the Conservatives, materially different or better to Labour in the promotion of freedom in finance? In summary, not really. The onslaught of the regulators against the financial industry has taken place mostly under Conservative governments, starting from the mid-80s. Yes, there was a blip where Margaret Thatcher deregulated, but that was a blip in the history in general of regulation. So starting from the mid-80s, when the Financial Services Act instituted a system of regulation of financial markets that was ultimately accountable to the state, to the setup of the FCA and the PRA more recently that have both been responsible for exponential increases in regulatory requirements and fines under the Conservative government. Yes, Labour is not innocent, but they cannot be blamed for ultimately being consistent with their stated ideology. Even Tony Blair himself was weary of over-regulation by the Financial Services Authority, which did not even come close to the levels of the FCA and the PRA who came later. And what about the Lib Dems? Well, as usual, they're the sneakiest of the bunch. They are not overtly in favor of high taxes and regulation. They promote the more benign-sounding proposals, like subsidies of key sectors and remaining in the EU, which does not fool anyone with basic economic knowledge and understanding that subsidies are paid for by taxes and most of the time come hand in hand with requirements, i.e. regulation. And I'm not even going to go into what the EU does. So in conclusion, when considering what we are in for with a Labour government, we need to remember that there may be some differences between the three major parties, but these are merely on the intensity of the application of the same fundamental ideas, i.e. that you can regulate risk away from the marketplace, that the market is flawed inherently because the actors in it are self-interested, that the regulators are by nature wise and just, and they act as the guardians of public interest instead of their own, and that public interest is an actual thing, and does not depend on every individual's dreams, aspirations, wants, needs, talents, and values. So don't be fooled when they try to tell you that they're different from each other. The three main parties have quite effectively and efficiently managed to put in place a system of division of labor which goes along the lines of the good old saying, if it moves, regulate it, that's the Conservatives. If it keeps moving, tax it, that's Labour, and if it stops moving, subsidize it, that's the Liberal Democrats. Thank you very much.
Andrew.
Thank you very much. Is this mic working? Yes, one of the things we've got to do, considering that we've got a general election and there's a possibility that Labour might get elected, is for everybody to keep an eye on that Britain Elects site. I don't know, I've always got it on looking at it on Twitter. And I think the closer if you start to see the share of the vote increasing for Labour, that's when you've got to seriously start considering going on to some travel websites and getting a good ticket to get the hell out of this country. What we do know about Labour is that their policies are fundamentally replicating those failed policies that are currently being pursued in places like Venezuela. And the problem with people, and I get pretty annoyed with people sometimes. The only reason I'm here is I'm a politician, so I have to pretend to like them. But actually, the problem with people is that they tend not to look at evidence, and they tend not to reason, and they tend not to be rational. And what they do is they rely on things like hope. I mean, presidents of the United States have got themselves elected merely by parroting that one word, hope, promising absolutely nothing, because, of course, hope is a huge lie. It's a huge fraud. Hope is an excuse for not doing anything and just relying on other people, hopefully, to fill the gap. And hope is what's motivated the Labour Party since 1945. They hope things will get better if people were just nicer to each other and that the government made them nicer to each other. And so the result, people like Jeremy Corbyn and people of his generation, and McDonnell, who I've known for very many years, they're sort of lost to reason. They are completely committed to the socialist project, despite all the evidence that it never works anywhere. What's worrying is the new generation of young people who are being persuaded by those seductive words about, look, if we just took a little bit more from rich people, a little bit more from the transactions that are going on in the City of London, we could pay for all these wonderful things. We could have unicorn races, and we could bet on the outcome of these unicorn races, and then you'd be in the money, and anybody who won those unicorn races would get free kittens for life. I mean, this is the kind of level of debate that we're having at the moment, and the kind of level of debate that's persuading young people that perhaps the socialist cause is the way forward, because they don't remember what socialism actually was like, because it's been quite a few years since we had it red-blooded. I'm old enough to remember it. I'm old enough to remember the British Rail, which was like it was like a travelling public health emergency. They were so filthy, those trains, I'm surprised that anybody ever used them at all. They can't remember situations where we have to wait 6 months for a telephone from the nationalised post office, as it was then, and now BT, and yet they want to nationalise broadband. And you think, where is the collective memory? Where is the memory of what socialism actually was like? So the financial, one of the things they want to do, of course, is the biggest thing is the financial transaction tax. And they're very, very clear about why they want this financial transaction tax be anything between 0.2 and 0.5% of a cost of a transaction. And it sounds so small, doesn't it? Just a little bit of money. It's just a little bit off the top. The reason I want to do that is because the reason they want to intervene is they want to take control of investment decisions. They want to take them away from private enterprise and institutions, and they want to centralize them in government. Now let's remind ourselves of those great projects that were delivered through state intervention and state investment of taxpayers' money. Yeah, the mines. The mines were a marvellous investment by Labour and Conservative governments in the past, And my goodness, they took years to die, and in the process sucked resources away from investing in areas which may have actually brought us out of those dreadful times in the 70s a little earlier. Concorde. Everybody loves Concorde, don't they? Because it's a symbol of technocratic Britain. Cost us an absolute bloody fortune and now no longer flies because that was a centrally dictated, centrally driven vanity scheme by government. Blue Streak, nobody will remember Blue Streak. I think they cancelled it when I was 1 year old, and that was the United Kingdom's attempt to get involved in the space programme. But more currently, let's talk about the Olympic Stadium. £500 million of taxpayers' money you're never going to see again. Despite my suggestions to the Mayor of London, and as a member of the London Assembly, it's my job to hold the Mayor of London to account, and I've said this to all of them, just demolish the bloody thing and build something that people actually want on the site. Or sell it off, really, and let somebody come in and deliver something that's sustainable. Crossrail. There's another one that we might be familiar with in London. And of course, now that's going to be 2 years late. It's going to cost hundreds of millions of pounds more. And let's not forget HS2. Marvellous HS2. And we've just had a government report out that says, yes, it's an indeterminate amount of cost into the future, but let's go ahead with it because it sounds like a nice idea and there's votes in the north for it. These are the kind and quality of investment decisions that government make. And there are no examples, I'm sorry, you can bring them to me, there are no examples of government investment that actually, objectively, worked. So this financial transaction tax supposedly is going to enable them to make all these marvellous investments for the benefit of Britain. Yet even Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, you know, the man who believes that he wants to introduce rent controls in London, rent controls which have never worked anywhere in the world they have been applied. Anywhere. Name somewhere. Actually, rent controls, just, I know it's off-piste a little. We had the not very right-wing expert in housing coming in from the London School of Economics when we did an investigation into rent control. And she said, the thing about rent control is it only works where you don't need it. That's the logic of those kind of socialist schemes. They only work where you don't need them. And so even Sadiq Khan has said that Labour's introduction of a financial transaction tax will threaten the position of the City of London in the world and our competitiveness. Now, I don't know how many of you live in London or outside London, but if you live outside the South East, can I just say, you're welcome. You're welcome to the subsidy that the South East produces for the rest of you. You're welcome. I'm only too happy to do it. We're one nation. If you threaten the financial services industry, we will no longer be able to subsidise you in your rural idols. London will no longer be able to dish out the cash so you can live somewhere where there's no shops, no transport, but a pretty nice view. We will not be able to subsidise you anymore. The City of London is that vital to the economy of the United Kingdom. And it is that golden goose that is being threatened by a Labour victory. They, of course, want to nationalise all sorts of industries, and you know what the effect of that is going to be by the nationalisation of things like, what have we got, water, rail, the post office, energy. They want to nationalise the lot. What does that actually mean for the city? Well, first of all, who's going to invest in improving the rail network or improving the water supply if it's a government-run institution? So not only will Labour take your money to buy those companies, but it will also reject the investment of private capital to make those services better. So we will go back to those decisions that we had when they were nationalised. For example, on the rail network and on the water supply. We'll go back to those times when, during the public spending round, when the Chancellor had to look at whether or not he should be spending money on updating the railways, putting more money into the water, but making the water supply cleaner, or an A&E in a marginal constituency, or more policing in a crime-ridden inner city. And when you're presented with that case, the decision's not hard as a politician. It's not hard at all. Who gets votes by investing in a tunnel under the Thames that makes water cleaner? Who gets votes by investing in a rail network to go to somewhere where most of your voters don't go? Well, you don't get votes, and therefore you don't get the investment. And that's what privatisation delivered for these suppliers. And they also ignore the fact that as they are privatised industries, they have investors. And who are the biggest investors in the city? One of the biggest investors in the city in those utility companies, those very things that Labour wants to nationalise. Well, it's the pension funds. It's the pension funds. So if you want to go and vote Labour, if you want to support a party driven by hope and unicorns, by all means, you do what you want, but you're going to be a very poor old person as a result. You make the choice. It's up to you. The fact is that Labour economics doesn't work. I'm now going to take a slight issue because debates are good. Debates are good. Yes, the Conservatives intervene too much sometimes. The problem with socialists, and the Blair-type socialists who weren't as bad as his predecessors and nowhere near as bad as Jeremy Corbyn and the current stock of Labour supporters, is that they never really understood capitalism, but they realised that you could make money out of it. They never really understood the city or didn't quite approve of it, but when they took over back in 1997, they realised that actually if they were to upset the apple cart on the city, that they ultimately would damage their plans, their soft socialist plans. And so they left it alone. But the problem is, because they were not capitalists and they didn't believe in the free market, they assumed that all these benefits of the free market come when you just ask industry to be nice. Look, as somebody who believes in free enterprise myself, I know that companies are out to maximise their income, and if they can get away with effectively screwing more money out of me than I want, they will do it, unless the regulations are there or unless the contract is there. And this is what Labour never understood. And that's why we had ridiculous contracts on things like the Private Finance Initiative, which we will still be paying for in many, many years to come. At the time of Labour taking control, they introduced the Financial Services Act, and that was debated in the House of Commons. And at that time, the Shadow Chancellor, he wasn't the Shadow Chancellor, I think he was the Shadow Chief Secretary, was Peter Lilly. He's still a member of Parliament. I don't know if he's standing down this time, but he was the spokesman for the Conservatives. And back in 1997, I can actually remember the date, that's how geeky I am. It was on the 11th of November, and you can check it in Hansard. Peter Lilly said to the then Chancellor Alistair Darling, or Chief Secretary Alistair Darling, he said, if you go ahead with these FSA regulations and remove the oversight of the Bank of England from the kind of financial instruments that were then becoming common in the city, it will end up where that lack of oversight will result in companies overextending themselves beyond their ability to pay back on their liabilities. The warning is there in black and white. absolutely there. It was repeated at the 2005 general election by Conservative leader Michael Howard. Labour decided to ignore that and said, no, it's all doing fine because we've got all this money coming into the exchequer, not realising that most of it was credit-fuelled, most of it was from the credit card. We've got all this money coming into the exchequer, and then, of course, we had the financial crisis. We are still paying for that financial crisis. We're not over it. We're not over it. It was only 2006-07. We are still paying back. I remember at the time having a briefing on that from the London Assembly, from the Institute of Finances, and they clearly said minimum 14 years before this crisis is overcome and we start to see the asset values that we did back in 2006. And that was because they failed to understand regulation. Regulation needs to be liked, but it must exist. There are certain levels of regulation that must be in the system. And it was that lack of regulation of those financial instruments and the extended credit that banks were giving to customers that could not pay back that was one of the causes, one of the reasons why in the UK it hit us pretty badly when we had that financial crisis. So when we say reduce regulation, absolutely, but we must recognise those parts of regulation that are important to the financial sector and therefore important to the British people. And finally, I'll just say, I just want to emphasise, allowing Labour to take control of the city will result in a new fire of London. And it won't be a physical fire of London. It will effectively mean that this incredibly wealthy, incredibly privileged city will turn towards the direction that Venezuela currently occupies. And I'm not over-egging this pudding. I warn you, the kind of people that Corbyn and his colleagues are, the kind of people, they will keep trying to prove the socialist experiment until cars are burning in the streets. That's the threat that we have to the United Kingdom from a Labour victory. Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll take questions from the audience. Sorry?
I'm going to ask a question before we go.
All right, yeah, let's take a few at a time, and then we'll come back to the panel.
In relation to the comment around we need regulation for important areas, are important areas just a subjective term that can be bandied around by the government at the time? It still suggests that there needs to be regulation. Assuming those regulations don't cover criminal activity, is it not just down to the private enterprises to decide themselves what risks they want to take and deal with the consequences rather than leaving it to politicians who have no experience in the day-to-day running of those financial institutions?
Yeah. Sorry, we're taking that.
Take a few more if anybody has a question or a comment. There's one over there and there's one over here.
Hi, George. You say that there's hundreds of cells of data that have to be fed to the FCA and those organisations. Do they have the capability to properly analyse the data that's coming into them? Are they really competent?
Hi there. I'm just curious in Mr. Boff's opinion about Boris Johnson. Is his only selling point, as it appears to be to me, that he is not Jeremy Corbyn, or do you think he'll make a more competent Prime Minister going forward than he has up until now, and certainly than Theresa May, who I felt was the worst in the last 40 years?
All right, let's start with Andrew this time.
I think regulation is acceptable where it protects the customer from what could be considered fraudulent activity. I think it's difficult to, having gone through the financial crisis, to doubt that what was going on was fundamentally dishonest to the customers. And therefore, I think, I don't want to ever more rules about financial regulation. What I do want us to do is have a debate about what are the rules that have to be there, and those are the ones we stick to. Because you're quite right, politicians will use regulation in order to get their policy aims and make themselves popular. So we have to have some kind of agreement as to what the notes. I worked as an IT support on the trading floor for a few years. Worst years of my life, absolutely awful people. But they were generating the money. They were the ones who were paying for the services that we value, and I want them to thrive. But from the financial crisis, we saw what would happen. I'm not competent to answer about the FCA. I'm going to leave that to you if I can. Boris Johnson. Well, I never voted for him. Politics is about choices, not the most perfect things. You can hope to have the perfect leader. Well, you're going to hope a long time, and they're never going to come along. In terms of the people in front, I worked with Boris for 8 years. I think the team around him is certainly competent to deliver what he needs to do. I think his attitude to Brexit is dreadful. But what are the choices? We either support a bunch of parties who are going to continue the agony, or we choose a prime minister. At least we're going to move forward. And as far as I'm concerned, I want to move forward on the Brexit argument. I don't think it's perfect, far from it. But I ain't got any other choices in front of me. But he's nice. I mean, remember, one of the things, actually, I do want to say one thing, because I get the perception that, feeling that people think that Boris Johnson is some kind of arch right-winger. Do you know he really isn't? Boris Johnson believes in things like amnesties for illegal immigrants. He personally, I know because I've had conversations with him, he personally thinks as many immigrants should come into the country who can benefit the country. He doesn't care about absolute total limits, and we've seen that policy shift over the past since Theresa May, and I concur. The worst prime minister we've had in my lifetime was Theresa May, and she's my party, but absolutely dreadful. However, Jeremy Corbyn will top her. So let's exercise the choices, the options that are there, and the best option, as far as I'm concerned, of what's available is a Boris Johnson government.
I agree with you that obviously there should be laws against fraud, and to the extent that there was fraudulent activity, actual fraudulent activity, that should be punished. When the companies were mis-selling, so they were lying, or when they kind of screwed their customers over in any way that was dishonest. The regulation that is in place, the regulation that was in place, the regulation that is proposed, and anything that we're discussing right now has nothing to do with that, has very little to do with that. The 4.3 million words have nothing to do with that. It's mostly around how you manage your risk as a business, as a private business, who you need to put in place to do what, and that sort of stuff in terms of micromanaging. And also when we consider it in this light, we see, yes, there may have been, in certain cases in finance, in all of finance history, all of the history of finance cases of fraud, but governments really interfere most of the time to prevent failure. That's what their concern is with. And failure should not be prevented, failure should be allowed. Failure is an integral part of a well-functioning capitalist system. Companies, banks, whatever, need to fail. Investors, savers, anyone who has put money in those banks should consider the risk when they put the money and should take the hit when they've made the wrong decision. Now, yes, in the UK we have protection of savers and all of that, and that makes things a lot more complicated. But in simple terms, that's what we need to consider. Fraud, bad, should be prevented, should be punished. Failure, no, should be allowed, should be permitted. And we need to also consider when failure comes from government incentives. So, for example, very low interest rates, subsidies, laws that are determining where you can lend and where you cannot lend, who you need to lend to, all of that stuff. Sometimes, certainly in the US, banks were incentivized to lend to people that they wouldn't have otherwise lent to because the governments wanted to promote home ownership. Oh, I'll leave it at that on that one. And your question about whether the FCA is competent. I don't know if they're competent to read Excel databases. I think they need toilet training before that. Because if you read the recent articles that have come out, the FCA CEO has had to write a letter to staff to ask them to stop defecating on the floor, among other things. So just baby steps. First we potty train them, then they stop potty training and they go into the toilet and start doing their business properly, and then maybe one day they'll be able to do a pivot table and a VLOOKUP. But let's not be too ambitious because the poor things, you know, they're trying their best.
On that very positive note, I want to thank both of our speakers and all our speakers throughout the day, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. All our events are, at least all the ones in London, are posted on the London Ayn Rand meetup, so if you are not a member, I encourage you to become one. And you can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and all that stuff. And I hope you join us this Wednesday to discuss Ayn Rand's essay, What is Capitalism? I think it's necessary now more than ever. Thanks again.